Welcome back. Now, in our previous video, we talked about why great presentations start with the audience, and we explained the audience analysis canvas and the 6 questions that help us understand who we're speaking to before we start building a presentation. So today we're going to take that next step. So once you've thought about your audience, how do you actually organize your message? And that's where the SCQR comes in. And if you attended the workshop, you'll remember using job A2 in the SCQR story builder. So today we'd like to revisit that tool and talk about why it works.
As one thing we noticed during the workshop was that participants often assumed SCQR meant starting with the situation and working forwards. But in practice, many business presentations are built differently, and that's what we'd like to explore in this video.
Yeah, because we sometimes see people treating SCQR as a presentation framework. The thing is, SCQR can also be an extremely useful thinking framework. So before it helps you communicate clearly, it helps you think clearly. It helps you decide what matters, what question needs answering, and what answer or recommendation you want the audience to understand and support.
Mhm.
You may also hear this framework referred to as SCQA, where the A stands for answer, hence that answer first method. That's something you may have heard that the people at McKinsey use. Now, in practice, SCQA and SCQR are often used interchangeably. So sometimes answer feels more appropriate, but sometimes recommendation feels a lot more um, appropriate for your particular use. The underlying thinking is exactly the same, though. And that brings us to an important idea: build backwards, present forwards, and lead with the answer. Because you know what? In many business presentations, we already know the answer. We've been asked to recommend something in particular. So a direction has been provided to us that we need to advocate for. The challenge isn't discovering it. The challenge is actually building a story that helps the audience not only understand and believe what we're saying, but also to support it. So, one important thing to understand about SCQR is that there are actually 2 ways it can be used. So, sometimes we're working through an issue and trying to decide what the answer should be, but very often in organizations, the answer already exists. So, the strategy has been set. So the recommendation is already agreed on. The manager already knows what the direction is that they need to take. So in those situations, our job isn't really to discover the answer, but to build a logic that helps the audience understand, support that answer or recommendation that you are making.
Yes, and that's where SCQR is incredibly useful. Because when the recommendation is already known, we simply work backwards and we start with the recommendation. Then we ask, what question does this answer? What challenge or complication made that question necessary? And finally, what situation does this audience need to hear first?
Yeah, and that last part is really important because the situation is not just background. It's not everything we know. It's not the history of the project, even. The situation should be chosen through the lens of that audience analysis that you've already worked on.
So if you think back to the audience analysis from video one, who is in the room and what matters most to them, what might make them hesitate and what would make them say yes. So the situation should be chosen based on those answers. In other words, we want to choose a situation that helps this audience to come quickly into the story, quickly and naturally. And if the audience cares most about risk, choose a situation that frames the risk context. And if they care most about customer impact, speed, cost, efficiency, or control, choose a situation that connects directly to that.
So the thinking process often looks like this: recommendation, then the question that comes before the recommendation, then what was the challenge that led to the question, and then only the situation. But when you're presenting and you're articulating that thinking process, you start with, here's the situation. Out of this situation comes a challenge or a goal. And so now the key question that needs to be answered is A, B, C, D, E. And so in answer to that, here is the answer or recommendation.
So that sounds a little bit confusing. Maybe let's work through a simple example. And imagine that, say, the recommendation has already been decided, and it's something about centralizing monthly reporting into one shared team. One step back, let's think, what question does that answer? Maybe it could be, how do we improve reporting consistency and reduce duplication across teams? And another step back, we think about the challenge that created this question. Maybe it's that different teams are producing reports in different ways and creating duplicated effort, inconsistent definitions, and slower decision making. So now, before we write the situation, let's think about the audience. Let's imagine we're presenting to division heads. So what do you think matters to them? Is it clarity, consistency, speed of decision making? Or maybe it is the ability to compare performance across divisions. So our situation becomes monthly reporting is a core part of how division heads review performance and decide next steps.
Okay, so now let's say it forward. Monthly reporting is a core part of how division heads review performance and decide next steps. However, teams are currently producing reports in different ways, creating duplication, inconsistent definitions, and slower decisions. So the question is, how do we improve consistency and reduce wasted effort? Well, we recommend centralizing monthly reporting into one shared team.
That's great. And see how we've actually made that work. We didn't start with the situation. We started with the recommendation. That's often how business presentations are built in practice. They're built backwards and presented forwards. And that's the essence of lead with the answer. That's also exactly why audience analysis always comes before the SCQR. Before we can decide what situation to use, we need to understand who we're speaking to and what matters to them. We choose the situation based on what matters most to them. And that's really SCQR in action, a simple structure that helps you organize your thinking so that the audience can follow your logic.
And SCQR works because it mirrors the questions audiences naturally ask as they listen. So they want to understand the context, the issue, and where you're heading.
And when those steps are missing, the audience often becomes confused. And they might not know why they're confused, but they feel it because the story hasn't led them naturally to the recommendation.
And this is what we call framing. Some of you may have heard that term before. So if you've still got your completed job 8.2 from the workshop, take another look at it. Don't focus on whether the wording is perfect. Instead, ask yourself three questions.
Does the challenge create enough tension? Is the question natural? And does the response answer it cleanly? Now, these three checks appear at the bottom of the job aid for a reason, because they're often where the biggest improvements can be made.
And once you've built a clear SCQR story, the next challenge is turning that story into a persuasive presentation. And that's where many people struggle. They know the recommendation, but they don't always know how to structure the supporting points.
So in our next video, we'll show you what happens after the recommendation. How do you build the supporting points? And how do you check that your logic is complete? And how do you turn all of that into a simple 6-slide presentation? So remember, SCQR isn't just a communication tool, it's a thinking tool. And when the answer is already known, reverse engineer the opening, build backwards, get your recommendation, your question, your challenge, and then the situation, but then present it forwards. Start with the situation, challenge, question, and then your recommendation.
And that's the essence of lead with the answer. Start with the answer you want the audience to understand and support. Then build the logic that helps them get there. Thanks so much for watching. We'll see you in the next video.